Now, we've been looking at different people that again, and why would we do that? Why might that be? Yeah, see, it hit me today as I was doing. Why would you do that? Why would we look at other people that were involved in Jesus' story?
Well, it kind of gives you a different perspective on things.
Okay, gives you a different. How so might it give you a different perspective?
Well, some of the Gospels line up, some don't.
Okay.
They don't even mention that person that you might
Okay.
be looking at.
So,
Yeah.
so that it gives you a little more perspective on the story itself. You know, when I did this, and I didn't do it in to this number, but I did it once before, and it had to do with the Chosen. People were watching The Chosen, and I was doing another study, and somebody came and said, "Was Matthew really like that?" And I said, "What? Yeah, the tax collector. Was he really nerdy and socially awkward? He seems kind of strange." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, you know, that's the way it was in The Chosen, you know." And I didn't know Mary Magdalene could read. And I said, "Well, you know, that's really interesting. Where did you get that?" And she said, "Oh, I saw it on The Chosen." And I said, "You know, that's interesting, because you know, you're talking about using Gospels that you can read. The Gospel of Mark, you can read out loud in 20 minutes. I mean, it's pretty short. How are you going to get 2 or 3 seasons worth of television, you know, based on something you could read out loud in an hour, tops? You know, you got to add stuff to it. And I said that's what they did with The Chosen. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you recognize that they're developing characters. There's nothing in Scripture that says that Matthew was nerdy, was an accountant kind of guy. I said that's the way people working for the IRS are perceived now, but that's not what tax collectors were like in the first century. They were more like mob bosses. I mean, they were pretty tough guys. And there's no indication Mary Magdalene knew how to read. I mean, it's just not in the text. But if you want to flesh out the character for a dramatic presentation, then that's what you're going to do. And so, you know, I said, well, let's do a series on some of the characters in the Chosen, what the Gospels actually say about them. So, but it's to get a better perspective, to know the story a little bit better.
And it kind of tells you what ones Jesus was closer to.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know?
Right, and why?
Have you all ever heard this? I mean, there was a lady that wanted to fight with me about this. She said that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus.
I've heard that before too. Yeah.
Well, and that's what Latter-day Saints believe, that Jesus had children. And that's part of what they believe as part of their doctrine. That's one of the reasons they have such a big emphasis on family, because they believe Jesus had a family.
Okay.
Which is kind of it. Now, in Scripture, is there any indication of that?
No?
Absolutely not. In
Not
fact,
even that he's married, there's none.
no indication. Well, and we talked about Mary Magdalene. Does she play a major role outside of the resurrection? Does Mary Magdalene play a major role in any of the Gospels? No.
Not really.
Yeah, she just shows up. She's mentioned in a list as one of them that supported Jesus' ministry. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, so she's not a major character except when you look at the crucifixion, resurrection. And then she plays a bigger role. And so sometimes to sort of to flesh out characters, you add to the story. And when you do that, you lose the people who are close to him and why they're close.
Right.
And so that's what we've been looking at. And we've looked at John the Baptist, who did what?
Baptized Jesus.
Okay, he baptized and announced his coming. At least in 3 of the Gospels. In John, he becomes the first witness to Jesus. He's sort of the first Christian. We talked about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the role she played in the different Gospels, although it's really primarily in the Gospel of Luke that she's important. Talked about Nicodemus, and he's something in John, a Pharisee who changes, right? Mm-hmm. Talked a lot about Peter, because Peter's presented in slightly different ways, but he shows up in the Gospel and in Acts and then in Paul's letters, so he's a little broader. We talked about Matthew and the tax collectors, and as you look in, and this is pretty consistent when you go through all the Gospels, how are the tax collectors generally presented in the Gospels?
Crooks.
Well, they are crooks.
Shady.
They're shady, they're crooks. How do the evangelists seem to see them, though? Are they the enemy, the bad guys in the Gospels? The tax collectors? No, they really aren't. In fact, the tax collectors are usually associated with another group that they just call sinners and tax collectors. And the sinners and tax collectors tend to be the ones that change. They're the ones that are receptive to what Jesus says. Who are the enemies? Who are the ones that are opposed to Jesus consistently in the Gospels? Scribes and Pharisees are the bad guys, and they are about as far from tax collectors as you can get, because they were the sort of uptight, straight-laced, incredibly moral people, and yet they were the ones that wanted to kill him, not the sinners and tax collectors. We talked about some of the apostles, and a lot of them were just in a list, but we talked about some like John and James and Thomas and Philip, the role they played. And then we talked about Judas. And when we looked at Judas, how is Judas presented in slightly different ways in the Gospels?
He's basically listed as a betrayer in all of them.
Okay, all of them see Judas as the one who betrays. Why does he?
Something bad, and that follows you the rest of
Yeah,
your
that
life.
follows you the rest of it. Well, why does he betray? And that differs when you look at the different Gospels. What is his motivation for betraying? You remember that?
Well, basically, it was fulfilled prophecy, wasn't it?
Well, sure, that Jesus is
okay.
betraying. Yeah. Well, what's his motivation? What moves him to do that?
The money?
Okay, good. If you look at John, and particularly if you look at Matthew, he sells out. But if you look at Luke, it's Satan enters it and moves him to do what he does. So all of the different evangelists, and Mark just mentions him, and that's it. According to Mark, nothing happens to Judas at the end. The others, at least in Luke and Matthew, he ends up either dying a horrible death like he did in Luke, or he ends up hanging himself like in Matthew. So each of them are viewing Judas in a slightly different way. And that's important, and Donna, you mentioned that a little while ago. All the evangelists, I keep on saying that because it's something we kind of forget. All the evangelists are telling the story of why Jesus is important. That's what they're doing. They're not writing biographies. They're not writing like a impartial, I just want to get the facts straight. They're not doing that. Instead, what they're doing is they're trying to convey to a church, a group of Christians, Mark, around the year 60, so you talk about 30 years after Jesus, Luke, about 70, which would be about 40 years, and Matthew, Luke, and John, somewhere in the 90s. You're trying to convey to a church why this Jesus is important. A Jesus they already believe, but why is he important? Okay? Everybody hearing music? Okay, good. You're not hearing it?
you.
Okay, because you never know when you're being called home. and if I'm hearing music
And no
from
one
on
else
high,
is?
just,
Music, I always thought it was a white light.
well, I'll take whatever I can get.
Okay.
Yes, if this is it, tell Debbie that I died as I lived.
Went out preaching and
Yeah,
teaching.
that's exactly right, talking, and that wouldn't surprise her at all. All right, so we got all these people presented in the gospel. Now, what we're going to look at, and last week we talked about the Herods, and all four, generations, that was before generations, of the Herods, and the role that they played not only in the gospel, but in the book of Acts. In the Gospels book of Acts. Okay, so that we've established, we've looked, we've gone, this is 12 weeks we've covered, this is 13. And we're going to be looking at Pontius Pilate and the other Romans. Okay. Now, when we talk about Pontius Pilate, what right now do you know about Pontius Pilate? Tell me what just from living. What do you know about Pontius Pilate?
He found no fault in Jesus.
Okay, he found no fault in Jesus. That's from the gospel
And he
story.
washed his hands
Okay,
to free him of it.
something washing his hand. There's a symbolic washing hands. Okay, what else? So that's something you know about Pilate. Well, you've heard about Pilate. What else?
He seemed to be fair and just.
Okay, now file that away. That's really good because that's going to play a role as we start analyzing him a little better. So from your perspective or from what you've heard, there was a fairness to Pilate. Okay? Anything else that you know about Pilate? Well, that's okay because we're going to be looking at him in a little bit more detail. What about the Romans in general? What do you know about the Romans in first century Palestine?
I think they were just worried about maintaining order and getting the money to Rome.
Okay, so order is a big deal to the Romans. What else?
I think they were maybe kind of disinterested in the Jew religion.
Okay, that's really good. What role do you think right now the Romans played in the story, or would you expect them to play in the gospel story?
Antagonistic, I think.
Okay, maybe they're antagonists. What might lead you to believe the Romans were going to be antagonistic? We're going to be bad guys.
Well, they killed Jesus.
Okay, how do you know they killed Jesus?
They mocked him and made fun of
Okay,
him.
mocked him and made fun of him. Okay. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. The execution, the way he was executed, is a Roman way to
Right.
execute. Not a Jewish way, but a Roman way. Okay. All right, so that's sort of establishing a base. We're going to talk about the Romans, in particular the Roman rule, how the Romans ruled not just Palestine, but their empire in terms of their authority and their priorities. And then we'll talk a little bit about Pontius Pilate, and you're going to do some reading and sharing because there's a lot about it in there. Okay, if you're thinking about talking about Roman rule, and we're going to split it in two parts, Roman authority and Roman priorities. What are some signs from the Gospels that the Romans had authority in the Holy Land during or around the time of Jesus? What would be some signs that you could point to in the Gospels that would say, yeah, the Romans were an important player within the Gospels themselves?
Well, Mary and Joseph had to travel.
Okay, that's an interesting story in the second chapter of Luke, right? And when Luke describes that they had to travel, and where were they traveling? Okay, they were traveling to, not to Nazareth, they were coming from Nazareth, they were traveling to
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem. I was gonna hum, oh little town. They were going to Bethlehem, right? Because what was happening?
Census.
Okay, a census. Now this is according to Luke, that they're going to Bethlehem. And when Luke identifies the time when they're doing that, do you remember in the second chapter, and if your Bible's open, you can flip to it. Second chapter of Luke, do you remember how Luke identifies the time they went?
Oh, the year of the whatever emperor.
Yes, he gives the time in terms of Caesar Augustus, in terms of the emperor, which shows that he doesn't do it, by the Parthian emperor, which is the guy east, doesn't talk about who's ruling in Egypt, talks about the Roman emperor, which shows that the Romans have an influence, right? He does the same thing in chapter 3, if you notice, when John the Baptist starts his work. He identifies when that begins based on
Tiberius.
another emperor, Tiberius the second, after Augustus, the second emperor. So evidently, at least for Luke, identifying time by the emperor was a way of conveying that information to his audience. Which tells us what? If Luke is using this to identify time, what might that tell us about Luke and his audience? What might that say? What's that?
They're probably still under that rule.
Okay, they're under Roman rule. Now understand, Matthew doesn't do it, Mark doesn't do it, John doesn't do it. They don't ever use the Roman emperor as a way to identify time. But Luke does. And he doesn't do it just once, he does it twice. Now, that would show that maybe the Romans are still in control. What else might it show about Luke, both Luke and his audience?
Well, it makes me think they're still under that control because it's the common time reference for them all.
Okay, it's a common, which would show that not only are they, because Matthew, the audience of Matthew, Mark, and John, are also in the Roman Empire. But evidently Luke's community is more connected with Roman rule. And so is the evangelist Luke, that he's more sensitive to Roman. Not a shocker that when you look at the book of Acts, there's a lot of Roman governors mentioned in Acts.
But wouldn't that be the same as if you were to say, well, during the Nixon era?
Absolutely.
Because it's going to hit you quicker than going, well, was that 72 to 6,
Absolutely.
So by mentioning who the emperor is, you're getting a physical time frame with that versus trying to do the exact year with it.
Absolutely. And I think that's why he does it. But it would only have meaning if the audience
Knows who the emperor
was then.
Yeah.
And since he's writing this in the year 85 to 95, we're talking about he's writing this, almost 100 years after Caesar Augustus is gone. But his audience must know it, because he uses that emperor as a time identification.
Yeah, because if you say Eisenhower, I go, well, that's before I was born.
Yeah.
It's a quick reference for you, I think.
Well, imagine if you said Eisenhower, and Eisenhower, we were talking about the 50s. What if I said, it was during the third year of the Coolidge administration? You know exactly what time that was.
Nope.
You may not.
Yeah.
But that's what we're talking about here when he's using that time. So tells us that the audience must have been fairly well educated, really in tune with the history of Rome. Certainly they were still being ruled by the Romans, but they know something about Latin history. This isn't an ignorant congregation. They're pretty sharp, which we can also see in Luke's grammar. Luke's Greek is very, very good. So these are well-educated folks. Okay, so we've got, these are signs that certainly to Luke, Romans have authority over the area. Jake, you said earlier about the way he died. Now, how, again, the crucifixion shows that the Romans are in charge because, remind me again, why would the crucifixion point to Roman authority?
That was their way of killing people.
Okay, that was a way of killing people. How did the Jews execute, by the way?
Weight, right?
Yeah, and what did they call? They did it with weight.
Stone.
The stone. It was stoning the Jews. And what stoning wasn't throwing stones. It was putting a really heavy weight stone on a person and squeezing.
Like the witch trials? The Salem witches, that's what they did with them.
Okay, I didn't realize that, but that would be the same. That would be what
Those who said
they're
that
doing.
that they thought were witches if they could withhold so many stones on them.
And what it did was it
Crushed.
It crushed them. You couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
And why would the Jews do that? Why would that be the execution way of choice for the Jews?
Bloody.
It's not bloody. The Jews put a big stock in blood, as the Spirit of God resided in the blood. That's why you couldn't touch blood or you became unclean. So the Jewish preferred way of execution didn't involve blood, but a crucifixion involved a lot of blood, because they were driving not through hands. Crucifixions weren't done with nails driven through hands. Why wouldn't you drive a nail through a hand?
Falls out.
Yeah, it would slide off.
Oh, yeah.
It wouldn't support your weight if you're out there. So they drive it,
Through your wrist.
yeah, through the wrist, because then the wrist would support the weight. See, the Romans crucified not because they wanted to execute someone quickly. Roman crucifixion was intended to be painful and long. It was intended to be a long death. In fact, you mentioned pain. When you read the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, they talk in one of the Gospels, talks about, I think in John, talks about grabbing wine mixed with gall, which is an opiate. And what they would do, and to give it to Jesus, what they would do is they would give the people being crucified a drug to kill some of the pain. Because the goal wasn't to have them feel intense pain and die quickly. It was to have them survive long enough that birds, because you couldn't move, that birds would do their thing, bugs would do their thing, and they would let people hang on crosses for long after they'd gone. Remember, this was to deter, the Romans used this to deter people from breaking the law. And what law do you think the Romans were particularly interested in reinforcing with crucifixion?
Their own, right?
Well, it was their own, but it wasn't like stealing or even killing. It was generally,
Set an example.
it was setting an example, something that represented a threat to Rome. If you were rebelling, or even if you didn't pay taxes, that's when you'd crucify. The other stuff was incidental. But if you were messing with Rome, particularly about Roman money, the Romans wanted you to set you as an example. That's why they crucified people on hills outside of city gates, so that people coming in and out of the city would see. Crucifixion was a rough thing. Now, as we think so, that becomes a sign that Romans have authority. But it's interesting. The cross becomes a little issue, and we're going to see this as Pilate's presented. Becomes an issue in the early church. Why would the cross, that Jesus died on the cross, why might that become an issue in the early church?
Well, it represented death at that time.
Well, it certainly represented death, right? But Christians recognize that Jesus died, because if you didn't die, you couldn't what? You couldn't be raised, and the resurrection was a big deal because it was ushering in a new age, the age of resurrection. Why
Today's
would the
essential.
fact that Jesus died on a cross, why might that be a problem in the early church? And I'll tell you it was. It was as big a problem as the fact that Jesus was baptized, and that was a big deal.
Because he was sinless.
Because baptism, because he was sinless, why would a sinless person need to be baptized? So that becomes an issue. Why would the way he was executed, why would that might be an issue in the early church? For all the evangelists.
He lost his spirit, right, with blood.
Well, it's bloody. Who, as we read the story, who's to blame, ultimately to blame for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ?
Scribes and Pharisees.
Scribes and Pharisees, right? Or if you look at the Gospel of John, the Jews, because that's what John will say, the Jews are responsible. Now, if they are responsible for the death of Jesus, right? How does the cross become a problem? If the Christian, and by the way, even before that, why would it be such a big deal for the Christians early church to establish that the Jews are to blame for the death of Jesus Christ? Why would that be
What's
so
contradicting
important?
the blood? If the Jews didn't want blood to be shed, because of
Okay.
what that problem that is, it would make it that that's the way they were killing him, was that his blood was being shed.
Okay, so that might be a problem, that this becomes a bloody death.
Yeah.
Okay, so what else becomes a problem? If the early church said, yeah, the Romans are responsible for the death of Jesus, not the Jews, because if the Jews had been responsible, how would Jesus have been executed?
With a stone.
He would have been crushed by a stone, right? And just like Stephen, in Acts, because he was stoned, so he was killed with a stone. Why?
There's going to be unrest against the Romans.
Okay,
If they're the culprit.
Okay, if the early church says the Romans are responsible for the death of Jesus, now the early church has got a problem. Because who are the bad guys?
Romans.
The Romans. Who are not the bad guys?
Jews.
The Jews, and the Jews are the ones that are putting pressure on the Christian church. And if the early Christian church, which is a little bitty church, starts blaming the Romans for killing their Messiah, what do you think the Romans are going to do to the early Christian church?
Kill them too.
They're going to
Try
kill him
destroy
too.
'em.
They're going to try to destroy him. So for the early church to survive, you can't have the Romans be the one who did it. So when we look at the story of Pilate, and you mentioned that about washing hands, what the evangelists are going to do is they're going to present it in a way, even though Jesus was nailed by Roman soldiers on a Roman cross because of a Roman governor, the evangelists are going to shape the story so that the Roman governor really isn't the one to blame. Instead, it's going to be
The Jews.
the Jews. The Jews or the scribes and the Pharisees influencing the crowd. Okay, so this becomes something that the early church has to explain, and it does. Okay, so Roman authority in the gospel itself is established by the fact that we've got governors, the timing, the cross. As we look at Roman priorities, the Romans tended to have three, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit, tended to have three priorities. So I think you could reduce it to three. What have I said before was the top priority for the Romans? What was more important than anything else for the Romans?
Money.
Money, 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 money. I'm an old history teacher. And I can remember telling classes, you want to see what drives history? Money. Money, money, money. Money, power, possessions, wealth, that drives history. That's why people do the things they do. Now, why would, and the Romans were no different, why would the Romans be so interested in money?
Because that's how they paid people, that's how they kept an army.
Okay, you got to pay people, right? What else do the Romans have to do? So you got to pay people. There are people on the Roman payroll. What else are they doing that would require money? And by the way, when they're paying people, who are they paying? That might be expensive. Who are some of the people that the Romans are paying? Not necessarily just in Palestine, but in general. They got to pay soldiers, right? You know, so soldiers cost money. All right? Bureaucrats cost money. All right? So Romans need money. Why else do Romans need money? Why else does the empire need money?
To make roads that stay with 2,000 years later still work better than ours here.
They're building stuff, like
So,
roads,
yep.
right? What else are the Romans building?
Temples.
Temples, aqueducts. Jake, you saw some when you went to France. The stuff the Romans built are still there. So the Romans are building, the Romans are paying. The Romans are shipping food around the Mediterranean. All of that costs money, right?
Right.
So the Romans are going to need money, and how do they get it from their territories, the territories they control?
taxes.
They have to pay, they tax those territories. Now, when they're taxing, what are the forms of taxing they're using? How are they getting that tax money? What form is, because when we talk about taxes, we talk about,
Wasn't it a percentage
Of what?
Of whatever harvest that came
okay,
in?
so you're talking about like a tax that's like a toll. I mean, a tax that's like a tithe, that you're giving a percentage to.
Right.
Or the monetary equivalent of a percentage. So the Romans were using that. They weren't using income taxes like we've got. And they weren't using sales taxes. That's too hard to collect. But they were collecting based on a tithe, the percentage of your crop. They were also big, and the principal way they collected taxes was through tolls. They had tolls everywhere. So if you were going to ship something, you were using those roads that the Romans built, they weren't for free. So the Romans were collecting money. Those were the ways they were taxing. And how would they collect it? What would be some ways they could collect the tax? Because Rome, sitting over in Italy, controlling the Holy Land, controlling Palestine, Judea, Samaria, Galilee. How are the Romans collecting, or how might they collect taxes in Judea, since they're all the way in Italy?
Tax collectors.
Okay.
Yeah, the tax collectors.
Okay, who would the tax collectors be? How would they get tax collectors? The Romans did something really interesting with tax collectors.
I think they used people who were, how do I want to say this, like, people were less opposed to.
Okay,
So, one of their own, they would find someone in that area that, they wouldn't be opposed to.
okay. Would the tax collectors do it just out of loyalty to Rome?
Well, the tax collectors collected their share first,
Okay,
and then made sure they had whatever was needed for Rome, then they sent it there, but they collected extra so that they were well paid.
now what's the advantage? It's like franchise. What would be the advantage to Rome? Hiring, Jake, like you said, hiring people in the area to collect taxes, and like you said, Donna, for a share of the money collected. The Romans say, we want a certain amount coming from this area. You could collect, anything extra is yours. That's your commission. Why might that be good for Rome? What's the advantage to Rome? Because Rome is focused on money. Why? What's the advantage?
Well, the local person is going to have better feeling for what that person actually owes to.
Okay,
Gonna know the fields, know what you can get out of the fields, knows how many times they're leaving their house to get on the road.
okay,
There's probably a language barrier that is, part of that too, that they have someone who can speak the local dialect.
okay.
And, yes, they use all that to their advantage, so.
Do you think people willingly paid their taxes? No, probably not. People never willingly pay their taxes.
They still don't to this day.
They don't to this day. And why do you pay your taxes? Linda, why do you pay your
Because
taxes?
it's the law,
Yeah, and well,
and I don't wanna go to jail.
that's it. You don't want to go to jail. If the Romans are sort of selling commissions to collect taxes, they don't have to send their muscle, they don't have to pay for muscle to force the collection. They don't have to staff the jails. That's going to be up to the guy who has the commission. So part of what extra he collects is to pay the goons that follow him around to make sure people pay. Sort of like you watch an old movie about, prohibition. That the gangsters come in and break your thumbs if you don't buy their beer. That's the way taxes were collected. And it was a cheap way to do it. Now, so Romans, in terms of priority, money is top priority. The second priority, I think, is peace. The Romans wanted peace. Now, if the top priority was money, why would the Romans be so interested in maintaining peace?
War costs money.
War costs money. Okay? War costs money. What else happens when places are and if you're having a war within the empire, you're not talking about a war against somebody outside, but a war within. What would you call that? A war within like a civil war. Not only are you having to put down the civil war, the rebellion in part of the empire, what else is happening in that area?
Taxes are being
You're not collecting taxes. People who are rebelling don't pay taxes, right?
Right,
So the Romans are paying a lot and they're getting
nothing in return.
nothing in return, right? So they want to keep peace in the empire. Now, who would be responsible for keeping peace in an area?
Soldiers? I don't know.
Well, soldiers could. What's the problem with individual soldiers? They have to be organized, right? So what would be the problem for Rome if their soldiers were keeping the peace?
Then you realize you're living under you're occupied.
Okay, the people there, and why is that going to be a problem?
Because unlike the tax collector, who's one of their own that they know, these people don't speak the language,
Okay.
for one thing.
So they may be more resistant
Yeah.
to having Roman soldiers walking down every street. What else is a problem? And I'll tell you, this is a problem that every conqueror has faced. Every person who's conquered large empires faces. It takes a lot of people. A lot of your people, it takes a lot of your people to put soldiers everywhere. Right? That's hard. It's not only hard, but it's really expensive. You don't have enough of your people to do that.
And so if they have peace, they don't have to put out all that extra money.
Exactly. So if it's your responsibility, if it's a Roman Empire, the responsibility to keep the peace, that's going to cost them a lot of money, and it's going to stretch their army. They're going to have their army everywhere. What happens when the Germans or the Huns or the Goths or the Visigoths start causing problems on the border? Now the Romans got a problem. If their army is spread out throughout the empire, it's going to be hard to get them together. All right, so then who, if it's not going to be the emperor responsible, who would the Romans, who would you think the Romans would set up to be responsible to keep the peace?
Their sergeant or general.
Okay,
or-
they're going to set, now sergeant on this level, general on this level, who might be in charge of the generals?
I don't know, I thought the general was the highest.
Oh, somebody might be higher than the general.
The emperor?
What about, who would be under, between the general and the emperor? What about governors? As you look at the empire, little areas, so different governors have a responsibility to keep peace in their territory? Governors are fine, right? Roman governors are fine. But Jake, the problem with Roman governors is what you said. Because a foreigner is ruling you, right? And people don't like that. And you got to pay for the governor. You know, you got to put him he's on the payroll. So what might be even a better way? Now, if you had to, you could use Roman governors. What might be another way to accomplish the same thing and it be even cheaper? What if you had what you could call client kings? What if you set up a king, like a Jewish king, to rule Jewish territory? Now, the king is loyal to Rome. He's part of the empire. But he's responsible
For his area.
for his area. And you don't have to pay him, because he'll collect whatever he feels is appropriate in taxes, right? The people can look at the king, and that's their king, and he speaks their language, and maybe has their religion. That king may even hire his own army to keep the peace. Something then the Romans don't have to do. Don't have to station troops everywhere. All right? Now, that's great unless the king fails to keep the peace, right?
Right.
And if a king fails to keep the peace, or a governor, what would the Romans do? What would you get a new
You'll
one?
have to step in and give it to him and bring in a new.
Bring in another one. Okay, so the Romans are interested in money, they're interested in peace, they're also interested in unity. That, to me, that would be the third. Now, why would it be important for the Romans to focus on unity?
Because if you don't have unity, it could end up being a big mess.
Could be a big mess. What kind of mess might you have if a country isn't united? Fortunately, we live in a country that is totally united. There's no division in our country now. So you could have wars, right? If you had a lack of unity. Now, how could the Romans, now the Roman Empire is pretty big, right? If everybody spoke the same language, right? Or had the same religion, that would be it would be easy to keep that group united, right? Because they have the same religion, they speak the same language. But the Roman Empire has a lot of different languages, right? I mean, good night. If we look at Judea and Galilee, their language is different than what they're speaking in Italy. Their religion is different. So if you've got an empire that's got a lot of different languages, a lot of different religions, how can you keep unity? How can you work for unity? What are some of the things you might do to unite a country that's got all kinds of different languages, all kinds of different religions, all kinds of different history, background? How would you provide unity in that kind of place?
That might be a hard job.
That would be a hard job. So let's think about it. What might be some things the Romans could do to keep their empire united? Because if they're not united, they're gonna fight, no peace. And if there's no peace, there's no taxes, there's no money. And so you got to keep some kind of unity. How are they going to do that? What would be a way you could do that?
Well, I think they're probably public works would be a way to unify the nation, you know, that they built such,
Okay,
you know, amazing aqueducts and the Colosseum and stuff like that that you could look to as a triumph. I think that would be a way to inspire unity and patriotism.
okay. So you get people to buy into the idea that Romans are great. All right? That would be a way. What could be another way? Now, when you're doing that, what are you trying to build? I mean, you're certainly building aqueducts and buildings, but what are you building among the people?
Loyalty.
You're building loyalty. What else? How are you getting that loyalty? What is leading to the loyalty? What are you encouraging people that live in a different part of the world, speaking a different language with a different religion? What are you trying to get them to do? People who identify themselves as Jewish or identify
Unite
themselves...
with each other and become friendly.
Okay, become friendly with one another, right?
Right.
And sort of get an identity that I am a member of the Roman Empire. Now, you said something about getting them to be friendly with one another. Now, if I have one religion, I worship God X, I worship X God, and you worship Y God, are we going to be friendly?
We can try.
We could try to be.
Yes.
What might help us become more friendly?
A common.
Okay, if we could have some kind of common religion, that would help us to be friendly. Just like Jake, you were saying about a common sort of national identity as Romans. If we could do some kind of a common religion, we might be a whole lot friendlier with one another.
Right.
Now, in the ancient world, most groups, religions, did they have one God? No. They had...
I don't think so.
No, they didn't. They had a lot of gods, right? That's polytheism. They have a lot of gods. And if you have a lot of gods, now you may have one God that's, for you, more important than the others, but you recognize that there are other gods. But I happen to pray to God X, and you pray to God Y. God Y is okay, but he ain't God X. And you say to me, God Y is God X is okay, but God Y is wonderful. What if I added another God to all these religions that have a lot of gods but focus on one in particular? What if I added another God?
Why not?
Why not? Would they accept another God? Sure. If
And
I
they would have a choice.
Well, it's just adding one. I recognize dozens of gods. I pray to one, but I recognize the other ones are gods. If I'm a sharp Roman, who might I put, or what might I put up as a God for everybody?
Caesar.
I'll set Caesar up as a god. You start having people start worshiping the emperor as a god. So even if I live in Syria and worship a certain god, I'm also worshiping the emperor. If I live in Spain and worship gods, I'm also worshiping the emperor. So what is the emperor doing? What's imperial worship doing?
Building a national identity.
Building a national identity. We may be different on a lot of things, but I'll tell you, we go to the same church. Or at the same church, we have the same symbol. And what the Romans would do is they would have big festivals in cities, offering sacrifices to the emperor, to the imperial cult. Why is it? And it works for most people, right? Because if I worship 12 gods, adding 13 isn't a big deal. Why does that become a problem for Jews and Christians?
They're monotheistic.
They worship
One God.
One God.
Alone.
That's right. So you can't go to a Jew and say, well, you're going to worship your God, but we're going to add a second one. Because the Jews are going to say, not going to do it. And so the Jews, that becomes a problem for the Jews and Christians. Now it's interesting, the Jews had an exception. Tiberius gave them sort of an exception as long as in the temple they sacrificed not to, but for the emperor. The Jews were given an exception to having to worship the emperor. That ended when the temple was destroyed in 71. When the Jews rebelled and they destroyed it, they lost that exemption, but they sort of established a new one with Pharisees. You could live in your own little communities. All right, so we've got the Romans doing this kind of thing. And this influenced Palestine just like it did anywhere else. Now, when we look at the Gospels, one Roman becomes more important than the others. And what name in the Gospel, what Roman name becomes sort of kind of crucial?
Pontius Pilate.
Okay, we've got Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate, and on your little sheet, is presented in all of the Gospels, outside of one example in Luke where Jesus is giving an example of something he did. Pilate shows up in what point in Jesus' life? Where does Pilate?
At the end.
At the end, around the crucifixion. Now, if you look at the little sheet I gave you, you see in the Gospel of Mark, there's really not much. There's not much about Pilate in Mark, but there is a lot in Matthew, Luke, and John. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like y'all to take, I'm going to give each of you one of the evangelists, either Matthew, Luke, or John. And Jake and Linda, I'm going to give you John and split the two because they're relatively long. So, Don, I want you to look at Matthew, and Ed, I want you to look at Luke. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at those passages and I want you to think about 3 questions. And then you can write them down if you want, but they're pretty simple, straightforward. What happens in your passages? What role does Pilate play? And then the third one is based on just the thing you read, what's your impression of Pontius Pilate? In other words, based on what that one evangelist wrote, do you think the evangelist thought he was good, thought he was bad, thought he was wicked, thought he was weak? What was the evangelist's opinion of Pontius Pilate? So if you could do that for a little bit, and then we'll come back and talk. So Linda, you do the first one, John 18:28 through 19:16, and Jake,
Okay.
would you do 19:17 through 30? In Matthew, what's going on in your passages?
Well, Judas decides that Jesus is innocent, so he takes the money back to return it to them. And it turns out that they won't take the money back and it's thrown, and so Judas goes and kills himself, but they discuss with the money that they pick up off the floor, they don't feel that it should be used for the church, so instead they buy a potter's field for it, for the burial of foreigners in their land. And they ask for who to release at the time of Passover, and as tradition, and they didn't want Jesus, they wanted Barabbas to be released. And then Pontius Pilate basically literally and figuratively washes his hands with it, because he doesn't want the death of an innocent man on his hands.
Something that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Pilate washes his hands. Anything else that is going on? What role is Pilate playing in that story?
He's trying to be fair with it. He figures, well, his wife tells him, don't crucify him, don't accuse him, because I've had a bad dream about it, terrible nightmare about it. But He tries to get out of it, but the crowd doesn't want it. The crowd wants Jesus crucified.
Okay, so Pilate wants to get out of this situation. What's your impression of Pilate?
Well, he's trying to be fair, but the crowd won't cooperate with him, so, yeah, so instead they ordered to flog him and, put him to death. So.
Okay. So he's not responsible?
No.
Okay. All right. So your impression of Pilate is that he's fair, that he's trying to be fair. Okay, but the crowds won't let. And by the way, anything about why the crowds are so insistent on killing Jesus?
The Scribes and Pharisees have wound up.
Okay. All right. All right. So this is Pilate as written in Matthew. What's going on in Luke? Is there anything different, or what's happening in Luke's account?
Basically the same thing, that Pilate can't find anything wrong, that Jesus has done anything wrong.
Okay.
And he takes him before Herod. And Herod never saw him, so he thought he wanted to see him. It was just, But the Scribes and the Pharisees again were accusing. And Herod told it. Pilate called them together and said to them, "You brought me this man who was one who's misleading your people and everything." He really couldn't find anything against him.
Okay.
He delivered this, and Pilate delivers him to be crucified to the people.
Okay. When he's crucified, does Pilate put a sign? He puts a sign out. Donna, you're nodding. What?
Doesn't he put King of the Jews?
Okay, King of the Jews.
Yeah.
On a sign. What role is Pilate playing in Luke's account? What seems to be his role in the story?
He really didn't want anything to do with it.
Okay. Didn't want anything, even though he doesn't wash his hands. He kind of symbolically does.
He just kind of shoved them off.
Yeah. What impression do you have of Pilate? What would be your opinion of him in that story?
Well, it says that.
Kind of wishy-washy.
Okay, so when you see it, he's kind of a wishy-washy guy. Why
He
would?
wanted to pawn it off on everybody else.
Okay, Herod, he tries to palm it off, and it doesn't work.
Herod didn't want him, so he gave him off to the Jews,
Right.
the Scribes and the Pharisees.
Okay, so your impression of Pilate isn't quite as good as Donna's was in Matthew. Where Donna, you said he would seem to be fair, and they pushed him to do it. Your opinion is that he's a little on the wishy-washy.
Yeah, he didn't got no guts.
Yeah, he doesn't have guts. If he had guts, what would he have done? What
He would have stood up.
He would have stood up.
For him.
Okay. Okay. So that's Pilate in the Gospel of Luke. Now, Linda, you were looking at the first part in John. What's going on there?
He tries to tell the people that he finds no fault in him.
Yeah.
So same thing.
And he didn't say it just once, he said it 3 times to him.
Yeah.
He goes, "I find no fault in this man,"
Okay.
and that. And, but I think he felt like he had no choice in the matter
Okay.
because they brought up Caesar.
Ooh. What were they saying about
And-
Caesar?
Well, if you, it says here, whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar.
Ooh.
And so they brought up Caesar to him, and I think that made him feel like, well, what do I do now? Because if I let him go, Caesar might come after me.
And Caesar is his boss.
So, right, so what do I do? And so at the end of the reading, he more or less left it up to the people.
Okay.
But he made a point to them that I find no fault in this man. And
Okay.
he should not die.
Okay. You said he said it 3 times.
Yeah.
What's your impression of Pilate? What's your opinion of him, based on
I
what
think
you read?
I think he tried his best to, he tried to please everybody.
Okay.
If he would have pleased himself and really went with his heart, he just would have let him go.
Okay.
But because of the position he was in, he felt obligated to make sure he done the right thing. But he took a stand and letting them know, okay, we can do this, crucify him, but I'm telling you, I find no fault in him to do this.
Okay. All right. In fact, he even gave him an option, didn't he? In your stories, he gave the people an option. What was the option?
Well, in Luke, it says that, well, I'll have him flogged and then release him.
Okay.
And, the crowd went berserk on that, and they're like, no, kill him, crucify him, give us Barabbas. So there was a way out for him in the Luke section of it, but the crowd went against it, so,
If they had just said, okay, well that's enough.
yeah.
Okay. Jake, what do you have?
Crucifixion.
Okay. What's going on with Pilate?
Where Pilate comes in the story is they're hanging the sign above Jesus that says King of the Jews.
Okay.
And the scribes don't like that it says King of the Jews. They want it to say he says he's the King of the Jews.
Okay. So what does Pilate do?
He said I wrote what I wrote.
Okay.
It's not changing. I'm not changing it.
Okay. What's your impression?
I think he is in a way disinterested.
Okay.
Or I don't think he's viewing it, I don't think it matters as much to him as it does to the Jews.
Okay.
I think he's motivated by maintaining order and power.
Okay.
I think he does see something in Jesus because he says, I wrote what I wrote, I'm not going to change it. So obviously I feel like he's saying this is my opinion of the man.
Uh-huh.
But I just don't think he cares that much.
Okay. He has other priorities.
Yeah.
Now, Ed, when Jake was saying that, you were nodding. Is that, you saw the same thing? Uh-huh.
Yeah, you can't find any fault with him.
Right.
Let him go.
That's what he should do.
Yeah.
But he
He's
didn't.
He lets other people influence him,
Okay.
and it's,
I think he's probably making a good decision for himself.
yeah.
Okay. Well, Linda, what you said, when they said, we have no king, do you want me to release your king? And the people yell back, we have no king but Caesar. that kind of puts him between a rock and a
A
hard
hard
place.
place, yeah.
Because if he releases him, he's saying, here's a king, you know, and the people, which is a pretty rough thing that the people say. For the Jewish people to say that their
Right.
king is a Roman, is their true king. That's kind of a rough thing for the Jews to say. As you look at what across all of these stories, what's the role of Pilate? And understand, historically, Pilate is really very different than he's portrayed in these stories. What I heard was he wanted to do what was right. He had a sense of what was right. You said he was kind of wishy-washy. Jake, you said he was not all that concerned, but looking after making a decision for his own self-interest. Linda, you said he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He wasn't left with much choice.
Right.
Historically, Pilate was a jerk, and the Romans fired him because he was a jerk. Pilate, remember, the Romans needed to have money, wanted money, and peace was the way to get it. And you wanted your governors, because he was a Roman governor. There was no king over Judea. The Romans, that was a Roman province. They were responsible. And the Jews are real sensitive. One of the things, when you keep peace, you want to make the people happy, right? Mm-hmm. And Pilate went out of his way to make the people unhappy. Jews are very sensitive about idols, having idols. And the Romans had a lot of idols. And one of the idols that they used a lot, the military, were eagles on poles. Sometimes you watch a movie, talk about Roman eagles. And the prior governors had an agreement with the priests in Jerusalem that the Roman army wouldn't bring in their eagles, because it would tick the people off. That's idolatry. And this is the holy city. You don't bring idols into Jerusalem. Well, Pilate did. He marched his the Roman base was in Caesarea, but once a year for Passover, the Roman governor would go to Jerusalem, because that's when you'd have trouble. So you sent the governor and some soldiers in to keep the peace, and they marched in with the eagles. Really ticked the Jews off. Something else that really ticked them off. Jews are really sensitive about the nudity, human body. The Romans and the Greeks weren't. And what Pilate did was he would have his soldiers around the walls in Jerusalem. Let's see. He instructed his soldiers not to wear underwear as they were patrolling the walls. And so when the Jews looked up in the middle of the day, they saw the moon. Pilate was a jerk, and the Jews were really unhappy, and he was fired. Eventually fired and shipped off somewhere else. But it's interesting, as he's portrayed in the Gospels, he's at worst wishy-washy, at best a guy who stood up for what was right. Much more positive. Why do you think they were more positive? Why is the gospel presentation of Pilate not negative?
They want the focus on the Jews.
They're focusing on the Jews. The Jews are the ones to blame. So that's Pontius Pilate and the Romans. Next week we're going to look at a character in the Gospels, in all the Gospels, that often isn't discussed very much, but is an absolutely crucial character. We are going to look at what's called the aklos. The aklos. And I think I've used it before. What is the aklos?
Crowd.
We're going to look at the crowds. And we're going to look at them not as individuals, because they're never presented as individuals. They're presented as this group, this group, the crowd. So that's what we're going to look at next week.
I think I'd like to see a Chosen movie about Pilate, because I get the sense, in a way, he says, I wrote what I wrote.
Yeah.
He's not changing it. So he believes that Jesus is the King of the Jews?
Well,
I've
and-
not seen The Chosen.
and
I haven't either.
there's a tradition in the church that he did become a convert early. Now, tradition, it has no credence, because when Pilate was fired and shipped to Gaul, he disappears. Historically, he's not important, so nobody wrote about it. But it's really interesting because of the way he's presented in the Gospels, as not necessarily a hostile figure, not like the Scribes and the Pharisees, that he's more a sympathetic figure, that he was open to.
Because I don't think he had a lot of options. I don't think he had a lot of options. He lets Jesus go, there's unrest, he probably loses his job.
Yep.
Yep.
So he's doing what he can to maintain, but at the same time, he's saying, I wrote what I wrote. So he believes it to some degree. So I could see over time, this could be a great season with Chosen, that he builds up animosity towards the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because this is how he feels.
Yeah. What happens after?
Yeah.
And then do the
Yeah.
Jews go and send a letter to Rome
Yeah.
about Pilate, because they're really ticked off? That would be that'd be kind of an interesting. It would almost be a story. You could write like a little book on what happens to Pilate after he nails it on the
where it
side.
eats at you, that decision. This might be a wild leap, but I always kind of thought that about OJ. He eventually got where he needed to be.
Yeah.
It wasn't maybe in the way it should have been, I don't know, but eventually,
He knew what was coming for him.
Well, he didn't walk free. He didn't.
he didn't.
He didn't enjoy freedom.
And I wonder, was Pilate burdened from that day on?
Mm-hmm.
So it's similar to Judas, maybe.
Yeah. Well, but certainly the way Judas is presented in Matthew, when he brings the money back and feels guilt and remorse. And, we've talked about it before with Jesus Christ Superstar, which takes Judas even further. That Judas is really filled with guilt. That this didn't turn out the way he wanted, which is an interpretation of Judas. Really based on what we see in Matthew. Hard to get it from John, because he's stealing money in John. He as a person has been stealing from it, that John says. So, but in Matthew you certainly can kind of come close to that.
It's interesting how we can't use that money for the church, because basically it was tainted money by then. So they had to use it for, to buy the potter's field.
Potter's field, the field of blood.
I also wonder, what's it matter to the Jews that they have to say he is? Like, they don't want the charge to be that they killed their own king.
Right. Yeah.
And, there's some,
Or large print.
I think large.
there's something to explore there.
Yeah.
But
And
that's
that's
really wrong. Let me see what
that's
that
really
is.
good, because one of the things you can look at, and I think this takes reading scripture to a little deeper level, is what messages are the evangelists trying to get you to see? What do they want you to take away from this story? And when you read a novel, that's what you ask. What does the writer want me to believe? What does he want me to feel, think? And that's really what the evangelists are doing. How do they want us to see not only Jesus, but the other characters? How do they want us to see Peter at the end? How should we see Pilate, and why is he important, and what happens? I think the evangelists are doing that and want us to ask those questions. Not all of them have the exact same answer, though, which is kind of interesting. Okay, let's have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to go home and I don't know, do something. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to look at Pilate. And as we leave here, let's not only think about what role he plays in the story, but how the evangelists want us to feel. And maybe even more important than that, how can we use Pilate as an example to shape our living? Help us to do that in the name of Christ, we pray. Amen. Remember when we were looking at Acts, one of the things that we saw when we saw all these Roman governors and officials, the one thing that Luke believes about the Romans is they may not believe, but they are just and fair. And if Paul doesn't, if he didn't do anything wrong, they're not going to lock him up. They're going to turn him loose. And that's why at the very end in Acts, he appeals to the Romans, to be tried in Rome because he's a Roman citizen. And we, the reader, see the Jews as the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests is almost hysterical. But the Romans are kind or calm, and they're focused on justice. So very, very interesting how these people shape the story.
I realized that they offered to flog him and set Jesus free. I don't think I ever realized that before tonight, that was an option for him.
Mm-hmm.
For him,
When you think about it, he had two options. Because the first one is, I'll release Barabbas. I'll release Jesus. And they said, no, I want you
Barabbas.
to Barabbas. And Barabbas is an interesting, because the name Barabbas means son of a father. That's what it means in Hebrew. Son of a father.
They ran out of names.
Which means when you see that, you start thinking, well, it's the evangelist trying to tell me something by that name. He is absolute. Every man is a son of a father. Is that an intentional thing? Are the Jews saying, we don't want anybody really, any son of a father released? Jesus has got to die. Is that what the evangelists by using that? It's like Luke is writing his gospel in Acts to a guy named Theophilus. Theophilus. Well, Theophilus. Okay, Theophilus. Well, you look at the name, it's a weird name. Theophilus means friend of God. Well, maybe his name was friend of God, or maybe Luke was saying, I'm writing this to all the friends of God. Everybody who identifies as Theophilus. Don't know. Can't get into the mind of the writer, but it becomes something interesting when you run across stuff like that. What's the intention of the writer?
When we were touring the Colosseum, we had the funniest tour guide, and there was a couple women from the UK who weren't that mobile. We're like in the Colosseum and in the Roman Forum, like it's hard to walk and it's uneven, and they're like, "Where's the elevator?" Like it's like, where's the moving sidewalk? And he keeps saying like, "Where are my ladies?" But he kind of sounds like Lawrence Welk. He was hilarious. He sounds like Lawrence Welk, but he was like very apologetic. Like he would say, like things were wonderful in Rome, and the Colosseum was beautiful. The gladiator fights were amazing, and then the Huns came and ruined it all.
Oh.
But my sister Kate did, and I was thinking that.
So in a meeting with all the Roman Empire, he was in Africa, different part, and he says, these Christians is the 0 to 300 world, they've never done anything bad, because the only things they believe in something different.
He sounds like Lawrence Welk.
He does kind of that sing-song.
Yeah. But the way he put, these Christians, they haven't done anything bad, so it's okay. They decided it was okay.